So, dear respected teacher, dear friends, breathing in, I enjoy the echo, speaking into the depths of the cosmos. Okay, now we're in the room. So, welcome to this evening's session. We're going to enjoy watching a dialogue between Dr. Elena Antonova and myself and Liam. And just before we do that, we have a chance just to establish ourselves in this moment, in our togetherness, in our connection with each other. And we have Brother Ting Kai here who will offer us 3 sounds of the bell to allow us to do that. And the session, the conversation that we had was quite long. It was more than 2 hours. Quite difficult to edit it down to 1 hour. So it's about 1 hour, 8 minutes, it's a little over. And at a later date, we will upload the whole conversation for those of you who are interested to see the rest. So I hope that in the conversation we don't refer to anything that's been cut. Elena mentioned several studies and we couldn't fit them all in, so you might see something on the screen that you haven't heard about. So you have to just relax and smile, be with your beginner's mind, and then later when we can upload the whole conversation, then you can enjoy that if you find it interesting. You also have a chance to ask questions directly to Elena, who will be on with us after the video. So if you have a question during the session, feel free to type it into the chat. But when you do so, you tacitly give your agreement to be recorded and to be included in the recording online. So if you don't feel comfortable to be recorded or for your question to be public, then please don't put your question in the chat. Thank you. So I think without further ado, we can just settle ourselves into being with our breath, being with the sensations of our body, and we can enjoy 3 sounds of the bell. Thank you all so much. So maybe, if it's okay with you, we can just, I would say maybe we just take 3 minutes just to become aware of our breath. And I have a beautiful bell sitting next to me, so I can offer us a sound of the bell just to allow us to kind of come into, a space of shared reverberation and presence. As we listen to the bell, we can just become aware of our body, contact with the ground. Wherever in the body there might be some tension, and we can just allow it to release, give it permission to soften with every out-breath. Just feel like yeah, with every in and out breath, we land a little bit more in this moment, in this shared space. So let's just enjoy the sound of the bell and our breath. As I breathe in, I'm aware of all the little traces of stress or worry that I've brought with me into this moment. And as I breathe out, I allow myself to let them go, to loosen my grip on those thoughts, concerns. Breathing in fresh oxygen, giving myself permission to discover this moment anew with no expectations, no preconceptions. Breathing in the freshness of this new moment, breathing out, relaxing into this new moment. Thank you. Thank you.
So we'd like to welcome to the dialogue today Elena Antonova, who's a lecturer in psychology at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience at King's College London. And her main research interests are in the neuroscience of mindfulness, specifically structural and functional brain changes in long-term meditation practitioners in the Tibetan traditions of Dzogchen and Mahamudra. And she's been actively involved in the Mind and Life Institute for quite a while, and so maybe you could say more about your practice as well.
Thank you, Liam. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation. Just a little addition there to my affiliation, because I recently moved from the Institute of Psychiatry. I'm a senior lecturer at Brunel University, London. So my kind of road to this research of neuroscience of mindfulness and neuroscience of contemplative science has started really in my PhD. I was looking at schizophrenia, sort of structural brain differences, but I already had my own practice of meditation. I started it when I was in my second year of undergraduate psychology studies. And I started it in DIY fashion, do it yourself, sort of by through the conversations with a friend. So I wasn't affiliating myself with any particular tradition. And for a long time, I didn't want to. So it was whatever, and it was time before the MP3s and any guided sources available on smartphone apps or online resources. So it was a real kind of exploration on my own from whatever little I was learning from the books, sort of giving me kind of conceptual understanding, but really in terms of my experiential practice, it felt very authentic because I didn't feel embedded in a particular tradition. And having this kind of mind that is interested in how things work, this sort of investigator attitude was very present in studying my experience, studying the working of my mind, studying the habits and the sort of miniature theater of life that plays out when we sit down to meditate, right? A sort of 40 minutes of seated meditation is, for me, is a kind of miniature of my life in terms of how my mind operates. And so as a researcher, then as a neuroscientist, I kind of came into marrying my academic work with my inner exploration of how mind works. When all things mindful became evidence-based and they became out there. And as Liam has mentioned, I mainly work with Dzogchen and Mahamudra practitioners. And it's because just the way life led me, when I realized that it's actually helpful to have a teacher, it's helpful to be guided by someone who already walked the road and can show me different cul-de-sacs that I don't need to get stuck in. Life led me to a Dzogchen tradition, which resonated with me very deeply. And yes, so most of my learnings, both conceptual and in terms of retreats, and the style of practice that I do comes from that tradition. But I'm a big fan of Thich Nhat Hanh, and I think his books on mindfulness are elegant and simple, but not simplistic. So I'm very excited and very grateful that we made this connection, and I can learn more about this tradition and your way of practicing and expressing the felt sense of the practice in language. This is one of the things I'm interested in, is the felt sense of the practice. Is there intersubjective agreement on that? But we just get lost in different differences between the traditions because the signs, the labels of the language that we use to communicate that felt sense, the subtle experience, differs through various historical, for various historical reasons.
Thank you, Elena. It's very interesting to go into that a little more, I think, and in particular, I wanted to circle back to something you were saying about, so your area of study is looking at how the grasping or the identification shows up in the brain, but before even talking more about that, just to really kind of bring it alive for everybody who's listening and watching now, and for all of us, I wonder if you could say a little bit more. Yeah, how does that occur? How would you describe it in this sort of direct felt experience, particularly with reference to the question, which I always try to remember to ask myself, when going into maybe a deeper kind of area of study or something that could become more abstract. I always try to ask myself, what does this have to do with my suffering? How is this relevant to my day-to-day experience? So if we could start with that, like, what does the process of grasping onto experience or identifying with our body or with our feelings or with our reputation or something like that, how does that actually make us suffer, first of all? Because then that helps us to kind of be motivated to maybe release some of that attachment and grasping. And then if you could go from there into how or whether it's visible in a brain scan, or how that shows up in the functioning of the brain.
Yes, well, for me personally, in my practice, when I started as a DIY practitioner, the motivation was, well, first there was an interest and curiosity to discover what's there, just from the conversations I was having with this friend who kind of gave me my first pointing out instructions on how to practice, how to look, and what to look for. So given this very basic map of, you know, those expectations, anticipations, and mainly I think identifications with, you know, with a certain aspects of personality as well. You know, the cultural identifications, you know, I grew up in the Soviet Union, I was a Russian in London, and, you know, a lot came with that, in terms of how I perceived myself and how others perceived me. But I also was quite, you know, socially anxious teenager, and then young adult. So there was a lot of things that I identified with, you know, that was me. And so the practice was, okay, what is left if I disidentify with all of that? What is left in my experience if I keep on seeing those subtle identifications? If I really relax, I mean, do we really understand what it means to relax? I mean, that in itself is a very, very subtle and profound unraveling, isn't it, in practice?
I think it's a wonderful question. Do we really know what it
Yes.
means to relax? And for me, it's a constant ongoing exploration. You know, I used to have quite severe chronic pain from the age of probably about 16, 15, 16, right up until just a few years ago, actually, 3 or 4 years ago. So even for many years as a monk, I continued to have this chronic pain, and it was a big question for me, like, what is the source? Where does this come from? What can I do? What can I change? How come, you know, I had this kind of terrible idea, oh my goodness, my practice doesn't work. I'm a bad practitioner because I still have all this tension in my body and all this pain, and what am I supposed to do? So I think these patterns of tension can be very deep in the body. And there's so many levels of relaxation that are possible. There's a kind of superficial, you know, just first noticing, oh, my shoulders are around my ears, okay, I can drop them, and then going deeper and finding that there's maybe patterns of torsion, of kind of twisting, of holding, that have been locked in the body for who knows how long, or maybe even passed to us, you know, by our ancestors, and by the experiences of our ancestors, by trauma, you know, generational trauma and trauma in our own lifetime. And so for me, yes, it's a constant exploration and a constant reminder of the importance of the very basic practice, which I think sometimes we kind of want to skip over and say, okay, I get it. Yes, mindfulness of the body, great. But what's next? Give me the deep stuff. You know, I want to go into non-duality and, you know, all this stuff. And I think it's so important just to remember that, in a sense, everything's already there in the mindfulness of the body. We can already touch all of it, goes all the way down, as it were. You know, we have all the depth we're looking for.
And one starts to see in the practice, in one's experience, when resting in this very clear, subtle space, how the thought, the feeling, this identifications, this preconceptions about this experiences, this cognitive fixations reflect on the body, you know, the distortions of and other way around, and learning to release them. You know, I sort of sometimes compare it, you were saying layers, so yes, it's the kind of layered onion, but sometimes I feel like sort of the analogy that comes to mind is like finding yet another straight jacket and wiggling out of it, you know, like an escape artist. So it's like literally, you're not undoing it bit by bit. It's just suddenly something clicks, you find it, and you slide into it, and there's just this new opening. But yeah, so that's basically what I was working with in my initial practice, and particularly this kind of psychological disidentifications of myself as this, that, and the other.
Right, because
And
we can be very tied in to
yes,
those levels of those layers of tension as an identity, as a, you
Yeah,
know, maybe we think in this situation I need to look good, or in this situation I need to perform, I need to be impressive, I need to convince people that I'm an intelligent person, a good person, a productive, but whatever the story
yeah,
is, but those become almost, um, yeah, inextricably linked to these body patterns.
exactly, exactly.
But then
Yeah,
what I also notice is in the letting go, of course, there are those wonderful moments like you describe of just suddenly, the straitjacket comes off and you kind of drop into a kind of ease or relaxation maybe you didn't even know was possible.
e- exactly.
But
Sorry, I kind of jumped in, but I grasped to the fact that you used the phrase dropping in. So
mm,
for me, it's very crucial word in my practice because it only feels authentic when there's the sense of just dropping in. And then, as you said, it's easy and effortless. So I've always struggled with the language of cultivating something,
mm,
because my experience, it's what you drop in, it's what you take out of the experience. And then
mm,
this is already there. This is just
right.
spontaneously reveals itself if you're not obscuring it by this,
Mm.
that, and the other.
It's very interesting the role for me of the word cultivation in the practice, because it is a word that we use here quite a bit in the sense of the not making an enemy of the mind. So we like to use the metaphor of the mind as the gardener.
Mm-hmm.
So we have this, the garden in a way is the soil, is the unconscious, or maybe we call the store consciousness, which has all of these potentialities in it for all, for everything, not only in us as behavior or feelings or thoughts, but also even um, the seeds of our experiencing a mountain, a stream, a star. Um, so uh, there's this sort of enormous potential, and then we have the mind, which can be at its best, in the role of the gardener, of selectively cultivating, which types of seeds do we want to see more of in our lives? Do we want to cultivate more compassion, more kindness, more ease, more joy? Do we want to, take better care of our anger, our judgments, our reactivity, that kind of thing? And so, yeah, I see these two things side by side. Is there's a kind of like um, cultivation in the sense of having skill in setting up and maintaining habits, doing things regularly, just the kind of drip by drip. I want to cultivate this. I just have to do it. I have to do it every day. If I want to be a meditator, that means I have to meditate. That kind of thing. And then once those sort of rhythms and routines are in place, I think there has to be, like you were saying, this very important aspect of just letting go and
Mm.
not knowing where this particular act of following my breath or just dropping into the sensations in my body is going to lead. Not having any a priori kind of thoughts about that, but just being open in a very profound way to whatever arises. And then so it's kind of like there are moments where you have to have some determination and energy to say yes, I will cultivate, and then you have to know when to let
Release.
that go. So somebody actually shared with me a very nice image which I like, which is that the energy of kind of diligence or the doing part is like turning the key in the ignition in a car. But once you've turned the key and the engine
Yeah.
started, you don't need to keep trying to turn the key.
Doing it. Yes, yes, yeah.
You let it go, and then you
Yes,
just. But maybe every day you need to turn it once or twice,
yeah.
something like that.
Yes, no, thank you for explaining the context for this word, the way they use it, and it makes total sense. Um, and it's one of the things that really interests me in my research is that language that we use, and so yes, when we use the word cultivation in the context of the path, yes, of kind of having the discipline to continue practicing, it makes total sense. But what is the language? What is the most subtle language that communicates A, direct experience, and B, how to actualize that experience in oneself? And I'm discovering in my sort of experiments, what I call experiential experiments with people that I teach mindfulness, either through a neuroscience workshop. I kind of combine it with some experiential exercises. I play with the difference, giving people the same instruction to just become aware of the sensations in their feet, but phrasing it slightly differently, and then asking them to give feedback.
Could I
You
just
wanted to
ask you
say something? Yes.
to do it?
Yes, well, we can do that. We can do
It's
that.
nice. I feel like, we make it a live experiment. We can all do
Okay,
it together, and
okay,
then
we
we
can
really,
do that.
get the direct experience of what you're describing.
Okay, so I'm going to give the same instruction, but with slightly different wording. And I would like you just to notice the difference in the felt sense. And then if you could articulate it, we'll share. Okay, I just invite you to close your eyes. And now just pay attention to the sensations of the feet touching the floor. Just pay attention to the sensations of the feet touching the floor. Okay. So if you could open your eyes for a few moments, just to reset, to press the reset button. And now I invite you to close your eyes again. And now just become aware of the sensations of the feet touching the floor. Just become aware of the sensations of the feet touching the floor. Okay, and we can open our eyes now, and if you noticed any difference, would you be able to articulate it?
Yes, I would say for me the difference was very clear in that the second time when you said become aware of the sensations, it was more this feeling that of a field of sensations which is sort of open, that's already there, and I'm just now noticing. Whereas if I am guided to pay attention, then there's this sense of single pointed attention which actually jumps around different points in my feet rather than expanding to sort of this field of sensations. They're kind of like a field of feetness and contactness, and not nothing sort of pinned down. I don't know if that's, anyway, that's what occurred for me.
Yeah, thank you. Liam?
Yeah, I would echo the comments that Lynn made, and as well more of a sensation of projection, I think, with paying attention, that I was sort of already knew what I was looking for or looking at in comparison to becoming aware. Sort of a sensation of predicting the feet. Something like that was more present for me.
When I give this different instructions to the novices, relative novices, one of the things they consistently report, you know, I would say an overwhelming 99% of people would report that with paying attention, it really comes from the head and it feels effortful. You know, there's the head paying attention to the feet, because we as Westerners are very much, it's our preconceived habit to associate attention with effort and this heady effort. So if really what I want to communicate is people relaxing into the spacious awareness, then telling them just become aware, they feel it's instant, it's effortless, it's put them in a space of ease where just the sensations of the feet come to the foreground.
For me, I find it fascinating to draw these subtle distinctions and then to explore in the experience, you know, how does that show up? And for me, the observation is that we as Westerners mostly are trained to dwell in our heads and identify with, I'm somehow, somewhere in here behind my eyes, there's a little, you know, guy saying, you know, pulling the strings. And and I, you know, I think if you'd asked me 20 years ago, where am I, you know, what is the core, you know, where is it located, I would have somehow pointed in there somewhere. Yeah, exactly. This.
That's what people often do. And if you ask them, that's what often people do.
And I think it's interesting to note that in Asia, they might very much more say this.
Exactly, and Asians would point at the heart more often than not. And more experienced meditators, I find, they might. So when, shall we do another very brief experiential experiment?
Yes, this is real live science.
So if I could invite, if you could close your eyes and just drop into spacious, open, receptive awareness. Without identifying with anything, without hanging on to any experiences, just resting in the flow of experience. And just notice the felt sense of it. And then I will invite you next time a thought comes, particularly sort of me, I thought, just grasp at it, just fixate on it, identify with it, and notice how the felt sense changes. And now we can open our eyes.
This is a very interesting experiment.
Would you be able to articulate with how if it was different, how it was different?
Sure. So what I noticed was when you invited us to fixate on a kind of I-centered thought. First of all, there was kind of quite a strong reluctance to do so.
Experienced meditator, that's understandable.
I was like, no, I don't want to do that. I'm quite
Yeah,
happy, just
yeah,
dwelling in
okay,
the
yeah.
sensations, the breath, and yeah, I didn't want to.
But we ask experienced meditators to do all sorts of unpleasant things in the name of science. So
Yeah. So I did my best. I did my best,
part of
and
our collaboration.
so what happened was actually I noticed my mind go to the past, and I remembered, which I hadn't been thinking of at all. I suddenly remembered, oh, I didn't sleep enough last night. I kind of lay awake for many hours, and I had some worry about this conversation. Oh, I won't have had enough sleep, and so maybe it won't go so well, and so on and so forth. And I was in the past, and also aware much more suddenly of a kind of unpleasant sensation around the eyes of not having had enough sleep, and a kind of like itchy burning sensation, which prior to that I hadn't been aware of. It was very distantly aware of. And so it was kind of like past and head centered, and maybe
Head
tightness
centered.
in the
Yeah.
jaw that suddenly kind of something changed in the set of my jaw. Yeah, I think that's.
So when you were in more open awareness, it was kind of where were you, so to speak?
Yeah.
What
So,
was the sense? So you said it was more head centered when you were grasping, but if you were to describe a felt sense,
so up until
kind of
then,
up until this kind of headiness came.
yeah. So up until that point, I actually felt really well, pleasant, nice, not thinking at all about, oh, I'm a victim, I didn't have enough sleep, oh, woe is me. I was actually just really enjoying the sensation of my breath. Uh, yeah, and actually felt somehow that I was dwelling there more in the whole body, in the contact with the ground, the breath, and also the space of connection somehow between us in this configuration, this conversation, being in a sense not really like, it's hard to say, but not really localized anywhere, but just being in this whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Something like that.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, thank you. It's very difficult to talk about experience because we really lack the language, of felt sense language, and that's what I'm, one of the things I'm trying to find, or develop. But yeah, thank you. Liam, did you notice any
Oh,
difference?
yeah, very much. I mean, similar, going from a broad field of awareness, and immediately focusing on a sort of identified thought to my physical experience. I think of on my something I know is sort of a center of a ego structure, if you will, a lot around the back of the neck and the head. Exactly the kind of areas that when the teacher says pay attention, then you tense your neck and head to fixate on one spot, because I was diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, hyperactivity disorder. So I have a very strong sort of habit of having to focus in that way. I could feel my attention narrow onto that very strongly immediately after sort of going into that thought, identifying with it.
Mm, mm, mm.
And
Thank
at this
you.
point, Elena, just before you continue, I really just want to invite all of our listeners and people participating in this experience. I hope you did the experiment for yourself. It's not just watching us as kind of guinea pigs in a laboratory, doing it as a spectator sport. So this is first person science, which means we all get to do the experiment, and then we all get to kind of report on it and investigate a little bit, like the nature of our own experience. I think that's very, very good meditation practice.
Yes, and when I do this experiential experiment, what both of you articulated is what usually said, and that sort of sense of broad field, I think, Liam, broad field awareness, where the awareness is evenly distributed and very much dwelling in the body and, and beyond the body, because we're connected to the sounds. And then this collapse, this heady collapse. And sometimes people even, point like this. Mm. So it's kind of a relevant space then, if you'd like me to introduce you and our audience to the default mode network. For a long time in neuroscience, we completely ignored the default mode network, even though it was showing up in our experiments all the time. So you probably heard that the brain, eats up about 20% of body's metabolic energy. And the default mode network, which I will introduce to you in a moment, it's majority of that. So on the top of that network activity, whenever we need to do kind of effortful cognitive processing, it's a fraction increase in brain dynamics. This network is associated with spontaneous thought and mind wandering. The researchers did what we call meta-analysis, when you take a lot of different studies and analyze them together as if it was one study. And the only condition, the primary condition for including studies in this meta-analysis was that they had to study some cognitive process, attention or working memory type, and use this resting state, there's 15 seconds of resting state fixation on the screen, as the baseline, as a control baseline. And in all these experiments, very loud and clear, this default mode network in green that came up. And the network in yellow and red is the network that we know associates with controlled attention, with the top-down attention. So this is brain looking from the bird's view. So this is the front of the brain and this is the back. This is the left side, this is the right side on the outside, and this is the middle line. And as you probably notice, what's very distinct about these networks, these large-scale networks, is that the one that is involved in attending to things out there and kind of cognitively processing information presented to us. So this is the lateral or outer parts of the brain that then get engaged and they're associated with the kind of attention to external stimuli and cognitive processing. Whereas the me network, the default mode network, is very much in the midline of the brain. It's very much, when we point here, it's very consistent. The blood flows, when there is a grasping, when the brain grasps, the blood flows, and we can feel that. We can feel that in our experience. So the lower part of this, called ventromedial prefrontal cortex, ventral just means lower, down, below, is associated with our personal sense of self, what we think of ourselves as a person. Whereas the upper part, called dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, is associated with how we think others see us, our social self, so to speak. And we also, this part also gets engaged when we take perspective on others, kind of this theory of mind. We have this notion of theory of mind when we extrapolate what other people might be thinking, believing. And this part at the back of the midline of this network called precuneus and posterior cingulate. So posterior cingulate is a kind of very complex area, but we can think of it as a kind of proto-self. You know, it's a sort of area that maps the body sensations with the emotions, with the memories, but it's kind of doesn't have that sense of separate I-ness to it yet. It's a kind of more of a soup, or at least that's the way I think about it. And then upon this kind of proto-self, the psychological self of the frontal part kind of builds itself. Lots of selves. But it seems that whatever, there is this kind of sense of grasping to the I's thoughts, sense of identifying with the I thoughts, sense of having this psychological independent I. That network is more active. But it's also active when we just access autobiographical memories and need to engage in some kind of narrative process, which is, you know, functionally important to us as well. So it's not a kind of all or none situation. So this network has a purposeful, useful function. It's more about how flexible it is in coming online when it's needed, when we need some kind of narrative autobiographical process to kick in, versus when we don't need it, when it just can go down rather than dictating the overall dynamic of the brain and interfering, let's say, with other processes. Because
sense of the kind of involuntariness of it, that maybe you want to rest or relax, but there's a part that doesn't stop. It just keeps going, keeps kind of chewing, ruminating, worrying, you know, fearing things in the future, regretting things in the past. And so, can you speak to that, you know, about how that might transform with the practice of meditation? Or, well, you take it wherever you were going.
Yes, so well, the next point I wanted to make is that, as you can see here, they call anti-correlated, because what you normally find is when one network goes up, the other one goes down. They have a kind of seesaw relationship. So if I'm asked to perform a cognitive task, then the activity of this network will go down, and then during rest, when the mind doesn't have anything to process out there, and it's, you know, free to ruminate, that's what happens for most people. And therefore this network was named default mode network, because this is what is active by default when the mind is left to its own devices, unless we train in meditation. And also what happens in people who have a diagnosis of psychopathology, and that includes schizophrenia, depression, general anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder. You know, if we think about it, with those states of suffering, they have different profiles to some extent, but they're also all characterized by hyper self-referencing, what we call self-referencing, hyper identification of self with, you know, a depressive rumination is a kind of excessive self-analysis of how did I get here, you know, and or you know, regretting the past or something.
Which
whereas
could be kind of like victimhood.
Could be victimhood, but it's kind of some kind of I, me type processes, thoughts that get regurgitated. In paranoid schizophrenia, for example, that could express itself as, you know, this victim I who's persecuted by others, or this perception of being persecuted by others. Again, it's phenomenologically speaking, characterized by this hyper self-referencing. So I became very interested in my research, and that's one of the things I'm doing at the moment, is differentiating focus from fixation. Because for the untrained mind, focus and fixation come hand in hand. We don't even know what the difference might be.
Right.
For an experienced practitioner who can rest in a stable way in this openness, then focus is a condensation of that awareness, of that spaciousness towards a particular content, when the context dictates that we engage with it, or we choose to engage with it for whatever purpose, usually benefiting others when we're at that level of practice. Right? And then when there's no more focus needed, then it's this dance.
Yeah.
And that's how people describe, how experienced practitioners describe it. But there's also this point, I call it curiosity kills the cat point, where you can get a little bit too close and then fixation happens, that grasping happens.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm very interested in studying this dance, and also what's the difference between this focus and fixation on the brain level. So this is a study by one of the researchers in Richard Davidson's lab in Wisconsin Madison. And as you know, Richard Davidson has done a lot of studies of experienced meditators from Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And so in this sample, they had many practitioners who were practicing Dzogchen and Mahamudra. And but it wasn't the Dzogchen and Mahamudra that was studied in this experiment. They just did mindfulness of the breath. Okay, but I'm supposing that someone who's an experienced Dzogchen Mahamudra practitioner would focus without fixation, whereas for a beginner, mindfulness of the breath, focus and fixation would come hand in hand. So this is kind of my conceptual interpretive framework for this study. And if you look at the comparison of expert meditators versus what says here, aged matched novices, and novices was a group of people who were giving basic mindfulness of the breath instructions and asked to go away and practice it for 2 weeks. And then they were brought back into the lab and scanned to compare the experts with. And when there was a kind of straightforward comparisons of 2 groups on focus, attention versus rest here, mindfulness of the breath versus just resting in a neutral state, kind of what we would expect, those right lateralized attentional networks. So this is looking at the brain top down. So you can see those right lateralized networks, attention networks, very active. And this is also the right, more active than in controls. And those are the areas that particularly stood out when you subtract one from the other. But something interesting happened when it's a little bit of a kind of, there's a lot of information, but I will draw your attention to the relevant bit. But when they split their expert meditators in those with least hours of practice, and by the way, the mean hours were still staggering, 19,000 hours, right? Ranging between 10,000 and 24,000. And experienced practitioners with the most hours of practice, 44,000 hours in mean, and then ranging between 37,000 and 52. Something interesting happened. So if you look at this graph of this bold oxygenated level dependent signal, bold signal, in this right lateralized attentional areas.
Okay.
So this is in red, practitioners with less hours. The attentional network goes up and stays up throughout, diligently. a little
effortful,
bit,
perhaps.
yes, and it also goes up and stays up, but less so in novice meditators who were given an incentive. They were given money if they paid attention well, just to kind of to control for motivation to stay focused on the breath in the scanner, because presumably meditators self-motivated, but for novices they gave them a monetary incentive.
Right.
But look what happens with very experienced meditators. There is an initial, as you said, ignition, the key into ignition to start the engine, and then boom, it goes below zero.
Amazing.
If it's really effortless, if there is really no fixation, but just focusing on the breath. So you are practiced in the practice of non-grasping, non-identifying, non-fixating on whatever. And out of that, you can just bring your focus to the breath. And actually, the usual attentional network, what happened to it? Right? So, you know, the researchers there in the paper interpreted in the context of, we have this concept of neural efficiency.
Right.
And we can kind of interpret it in the context of automaticity, you know, when something became a kind of a habit, an easy thing. You just, you know, need less resources to do it, which not necessarily incompatible with what I'm saying, but, you know, I just interpret it slightly different. It's not just this kind of habit and automaticity, it just became effortless because this people really practiced, really experienced, really stable in not collapsing whatever they need to focus into fixation.
I think probably most of us have touched it as well in what might be described a kind of flow state where
Exactly.
we don't get in the way of ourselves, you know, if sometimes just by grace, you know, something that you've trained at for a while, you're able to get into a concentrated state where you don't have anxious thoughts, you don't have the inner critic on your shoulder, you don't have the worry about the perceptions of others, how it will be judged. You just do it, and and that's a fundamentally very enjoyable state where the self doesn't really intervene. There's just a kind of, ideally, a kind of outpouring of creativity or engagement with a task that it's kind of like unobstructed. And I think meditation does also very much help us to train more and to be more sensitive to the arising of that state or the potential obstacles to it. I think for me, I really noticed it as a composer. I was a composer before I became a monk, and even as a monk, Thai encouraged me to continue, to develop myself as a musician and to write chants for the community. And that's not just me, but all of us, in our tradition, Thai really wanted to emphasize that Zen and art, or, the cultivation of a talent, can very well go together. And in fact, historically, they always have, so the calligraphers or poets or even just the art of drinking a cup of tea can be a kind of art form. But I've really noticed the difference between, before I ordained, when composing for me was kind of like it was a fairly torturous process with, I would say, lots and lots of not just self, but many selves, many kind of fragmented identities and voices of, like, what will people think? Am I gonna, is this relevant? Is this new enough? Is this pastiche? Is this cliched? Is this, the next masterpiece? Is, what will the critics think? All of these kind of minds commenting and obstructing the process. And now, much more I experience just a sort of this note and the next note and the next note and the next note and the next note and another note, and it's much more effortless and much more enjoyable, much quicker too, and much less kind of effortful, and yes, yeah, it's nice to explore that, and I think whatever training we do in meditation goes very much hand in hand with developing the kind of sensitivity to, what is that mechanism of grasping? When does it come up? How can I learn to, loosen it, relax it, let it release, so I don't get caught in it.
Yes, and I just wanted to make 2 points, if I may. One is that more kind of a commentary in what you just said, those sort of self-critical thoughts, the self-conscious evaluations that can hold us back from creative activity, or even when we have to do kind of cognitive task. We know from neuroimaging studies that, again, it would be the default mode network popping up when it should be down. Yep. And actually people with diagnosis of various common mental disorders, they find it very difficult to deactivate the default mode network when they have to engage in some kind of cognitive task. And it's very much phenomenologically associated with them evaluating their performance and having thoughts on I'm worthless, it's often tied up to this kind of low self-esteem and this self-conscious state, self-evaluation,
high self-esteem.
Self-critic.
High self-esteem, I think, is equally
could be, yes, the perfection. Well, yes, but I also wanted to share my
grandiosity or something.
Yes, so yes, the default mode network can, depending on what else it co-activates with, it can have a signature of one or the other. But I also wanted to share my personal experience, because you gave a very good well, you shared your experience in terms of creative activity. But for me, the first door was doing sports. I think, the athlete, what we call athlete zone, is also same state, the sort of this mindfulness in action, this performing out of the state. And I did a lot of high jumping when I was at school, despite my modest height. And I'm not saying it as to brag, but as to make a point. I was the shortest in the whole team. I was twice the champion of the former Soviet Union in high jumping. Wow. And I'm completely attributing it to the fact that through sheer dumb luck, I stumbled upon the athlete zone. I didn't know such term. There wasn't such term at the time. I wasn't taught it deliberately by my coach. I like straight jacket, twist. I just liberated myself into it one time. And somehow I then learned to tap into it. If you ask me how, I wouldn't be able to tell you, but I could find it. And that hugely enhanced my performance. It was effortless. Wherever I had to jump, I would fly, There was obviously a limit again to what I could do. And it was an amazing state. It was a, state of incredible peace, but also very dynamic energy. It was like really, I was like really present. That's the best way. Like you're really present, and there was no thoughts, there was no self-consciousness. There could be as much noise as there was, but I was just there. I was just, and actually I wasn't there. I was just doing. I was just the jumping would just happen. Yeah. And I used to dream, when I stopped training, I used to dream about this state for years. But I so closely associated with high jumping that for me that was the state of high jumping.
Right.
And so when I discovered, and then when I discovered meditation, I was like, I know this state. I know this state, but for me, it was the state of high jumping.
Right.
So then for me, meditation was, just in my own kind of process, a way to decontextualize this state, to dissociate it from meditation and make it available at any time. That's what really meditation became for me.
This is fascinating, and it reminds me immediately of what I think would probably, I consider to be what was my kind of gate, my entry, or the realization that I already knew this state. For me, it arose in the what I would call effortless present moment listening, that only arose either in playing chamber music, string quartets. I'm a cellist, and sometimes listening to music, but only really in live concerts, when I would suddenly find myself dropping into this totally concentrated present moment state of being one with the music, with the listening, with no intervention of thinking about the music or narrative consciousness, or it was just, I was in, through, and with the music, with nothing else. Just, there's this, a kind of, as though I was in that moment writing it myself somehow, right, with the composer and with the performers, in this arising of sound and wonder. And it was only when I came to Plum Village, so I knew that, and I always found it amazing, but I never really knew how it came about, or why sometimes it didn't come about. And it was only when I encountered Tai, and it was actually through the experience of listening to his voice as he was teaching, I suddenly found myself there again. But I was listening to his voice, but not so much to the semantic content, but to the sound and the timbre and the quality and the vibration of compassion in his voice, that I was then just completely without any thinking about, commenting on, no filter. And for me, it's like an experience of grace, almost. Like I count myself very lucky in the sense that I could taste that, or I somehow had the fortune to have had access to that through music, and then could then recognize it. But then I recognize it's still very much work in progress then to translate that to other areas. And I think it takes a lot of training to be able to then to discover that kind of stability of concentration in the other spheres, as it were, of experience.
I think it's very important for all of us to recognize we know the state already from somewhere, somehow. Skiing down the mountain, for example, when you get out of your own way. So meditation is then just making it available at any time, learning what obscures the states from our being. What it is that our straitjacket that we get ourselves into when we don't feel it. For me, exactly. Anyways.
Yes, it can be a very, very helpful reflection that we can all do, to explore in our experience. Like, when have I tasted this, or a hint of this? And, what were the circumstances? And then to be scientific about it, to kind of look like, okay, what were the conditions that were in place? And then what are the conditions that inhibit the arising of that? And perhaps how can I train, to either release certain things or cultivate other things?
Yes, yeah. And cultivating certain things, of course, like compassion. My teacher says compassion is the highway to non-dual awareness, right? So cultivating certain qualities, because they they are the qualities of that way of being present, that way of being. They take us there quicker. They kind of direct doorways. I think that's how I understand it, where then cultivation kicks in, where cultivation is important.
Thank you so much, Elena. I've really enjoyed having this dialogue and interaction, and I love the aspect of being able to do this kind of live investigation, kind of real life first person science. I hope that we can all treat our practice like that, as a kind of laboratory, where we get to do these experiments again and again. And for me, the coming together of the spiritual practice and the scientific attitude and method even, yes, I think there's a lot of potential there. And so if as we move towards closing, I really just, on behalf of everybody here in Plum Village, I want to just express our gratitude for you having taken the time and being willing to enter into this spirit of dialogue and exchange, not only between science and spirituality or the practice of meditation, but also between different traditions of meditation, different schools and different approaches. So for me it's been very engaging, very enjoyable, and I'm pretty sure that for everyone watching and participating, it would have been too. So on behalf of all of us here in Plum Village, yes, thank you. Thank you for joining us like this.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much, Liam, for organizing, and everyone else who was involved in organizing and recording and then editing. So, and I hope for some future in-person meetings, and I always wanted to visit Plum Village. So hopefully the circumstances will allow us soon to hold future conversations in person.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Elena. And thank you, Liam, for creating this these conditions, bringing it together. We might have some lined up already online.
Hello, everyone. Nice to be with you.
Good evening. 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 Okay, we're back into the
I think we are. Just getting a message that the sound problem has been fixed. Could
Okay.
you wave your hands if you could see me? Is my video on for the audience? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Yes, the audience
Okay.
can see me.
Okay, Elena, we have the first question from Vinod. Just a moment. I did. It doesn't do it. How many times do I have to click it? No.
You have to click on the left. Yeah, he needs to select in his screen unmute. He needs to accept it.
Okay.
Good afternoon from Hanover, New Hampshire in the USA. So thank you very much for a lovely, a very enlightening conversation. Dear Thai, dear Sangha. So my question is about our collective human brains and the impact of billions of us going on social media these days. Constantly immersed for hours at a time on Twitter, WhatsApp, etc., etc. Oh, any thoughts from you as to the impact of this social media immersion on both individual and collective human brains, and whether they're your thoughts and comments and actual science, if there is any? Thank you.
There is some science of this. I'm not an expert on it, but from what I know, and you probably heard that also through public dissemination of scientific finding, that it's really disrupts our attentional span, and it's also how we engage with social media. So if we are getting into this, what John Teasdale called this kind of emotive reacting mode, when we are in this fixating state, when we are totally caught up with what we presented with, then yes, we're just practicing emotive reacting and we're becoming experts on that. You know, the brains learn through repetition, and if we repetitively engage in these behaviors, that's what is going to be our kind of default state, default mode.
If I may follow up, it was more about the anti-correlated networks and your mini-me network. I wonder what that does to brain energy consumption and how much reserve is left for discriminative thinking, or some of your comments along that line. The science, I'm sure, is way behind, but I'm intrigued by what you might be thinking about that.
Yes, so I don't know the exact numbers, you know, I don't think anyone really quantified if we spend, 3 hours on Facebook, how much of our brain's metabolic energy or body's metabolic energy we would have burnt. Maybe someone did that, but I'm not aware of it. But we can extrapolate from what we know and what's been presented, that given that this brain network is so metabolically expensive, if we spend prolonged periods of time and engaged in activity that this network kind of supports, associated with in activation, then yes, I think we all have this personal experience of being drained. If we are, on Facebook, I have very few social media accounts, so Facebook is the only one. But at the same time, we can use Facebook in a mindful way. Everything is a double-edged sword, potentially. So the way of presence that we bring to engaging in social media, I think for a lot of people, particularly in the context of the current pandemic, it's been often the only way to connect with this outside world, the only way to experience social connection. So this mindful awareness, this way of being connected to oneself, and this experience, this rotation towards our experience, when we're not, caught up in it, when we're not fixated on it, when we're not emotively reacting to it, that can be extended to anything, including our social media engagement. You know, it can be another practice, another mindfulness practice. We can remind ourselves, you know, if I'm using it as a way to distract myself from myself, then maybe I'm not engaging with it.
Yeah. But
Yes,
most do.
that's right. But that's where it becomes a practice, isn't it? If it's a way of escaping, if it's a way of running away from myself, and filling my mind with other stuff, so because I'm not able to be present with my thoughts and my feelings, then maybe it's not such a good thing. But if we have a mindful perspective on it, and it's a way of getting information that you otherwise wouldn't come across, staying connected with your friends that are far away, you not hear from for years otherwise, then we can bring that juice, you know, that mindfulness juice, even in our engagement to social media.
I don't think you would have become a high jumper if you were on social media. The reason I'm saying that is I have watched my dear partner change over the last 6 years from a person who did everything to a person who knows everything. Because 4 or 5 hours on, and I find that when I do Twitter for a few hours, I know so much, but I don't do much with it. So I just throw it out there for your thinking. I'll stop. Thank you.
Yes, I think we probably agree is to what extent we are, as you're using the word, immersed into it. You know, how we are perhaps caught up in our reactions to what we're seeing, engrossed in it rather than being present.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Elena. The next question is from Mike.
Hello. First of all, thank you for this nice talk with Lynn. It was very easy to follow along. I have a question about this graph where I think you showed the default mode network activation over time, where we had this turning off the ignition. So the way I saw it was that actually novice meditators are displaying less default mode network activation than those than the lower group of the long-term meditators, because the red line was above this blue line. Is that correct? And if so, why? Does it then mean that actually people who have experienced in meditation might have more problems distinguishing between this focus and fixation than people who are complete novices?
Well, the slide, the graph of both signal differentiating novices, less experienced meditators, and more experienced meditators. It was actually the signal wasn't extracted from the default mode network. It was extracted from the attentional networks. So that slide was showing as a demonstration that when we think about focused attention, let's say focusing on the breath as a mindfulness practice, for many of us at the beginning, it's kind of focuses intermingled with fixation through our habitual tendency to put too much effort into things, to kind of, you know, for many of us through our upbringing, our schooling, this is our default way of focusing attention, directing it towards something. And we habitually transfer it to simple practice such as mindfulness of the breath. And everything we know about attentional networks from neuroscience, from using fMRI, you can say we know by studying people who, when they direct attention to an activity or to stimuli outside, is when that focus and fixation come together, you know, just through kind of habitual association, automatic coupling. So that was the upper part of it. So that sort of effortful mindfulness, effortful mindful focus seems to trigger great activation of this attentional network, which is then sustained throughout the practice of focus of the breath. Is your kind of perfect, effortful, diligent mindfulness. But if you then look at the activity of this network, of the signal from this network in very experienced practitioners who presumably will have very effortless mindful awareness of the breath or mindfulness of the breath, there is an initial spike in its activity, but then it is just, it disappears, throughout the run, when the practitioner is instructed to keep on focusing on mindfulness of the breath. It's actually below its initial kind of level of activation. So it seems that when we are engaging in these practices effortlessly, the brain, the networks that we would be expected to associate with this activity, such as the attentional network, is actually not active in a sustained manner. I brought that slide up in the context of Brother Fabling comment that perhaps there is something around about the activity moving from the left side of the brain to the right side of the brain when we're in this kind of more spacious way of processing information, of more kind of a spacious state of awareness. And because this attentional network is actually located on the right side of the brain, there was by way of demonstrating that that's not necessarily the case. It seems that, less is more when it comes to mindfulness, when it comes to resting in spacious awareness, when we truly get it, when we're truly able to do it effortlessly, then we don't even have this we don't see this sustained activation of attentional network that we would expect when we asked to pay attention to a particular activity. And that was also used as a way to demonstrate that difference between focus and fixation, that focus can be effortless, focus can be from that way of being spacious without having to collapse into this kind of effortful fixated state that we often find ourselves when we engage in some conceptual processing, and even when we ask just to be mindful of our breath. I hope it clarifies it. So this slide was not to do with the default mode network. That was to do with the right side hemispheric attentional networks and mindfulness of the breath.
Okay, thank you so much, Elena. The next question is from Susie McKenzie. Unmute.
Hello. Yes. Hello. Elena. Thank you so much. It's really engaging talk, and I've really got involved in the conversation. It's really interesting. My question was about this kind of spacious state of awareness that the really expert monastic practitioners got into. But you said they came from one particular tradition. So I'd be interested to know, has anyone done any comparison with different types of practitioner or people coming from different traditions? So there's Tibetan Buddhist, there's Zen Buddhist, there's Christian, Muslim, Hindu, a lot of different traditions have a tradition of some form of mindfulness or meditation or contemplative prayer. Do they all reach the same place, do you think?
Susie, this is a very interesting and a very good question, and something I would really like the funders to give me money to investigate, but they're not forthcoming. I think a lot of us have this question and would like to have a look into it. A lot of us, would like to keep the notion open that all roads lead to Rome, and that we shouldn't get fixated on the roads or on the fingers, that point in the same direction, but look at what they're pointing at and research that. There are no published studies that directly compare in the traditions. As I mentioned, not because there is lack of interest amongst us people who studied, it's just more lack of funding to do it properly. I have done a comparative study of Dzogchen Mahamudra practitioners from Tibetan Buddhist tradition and Zen tradition, which involved also very elaborate, detailed interviews about their felt sense when they rest in this kind of non-dual awareness. I was kind of very persistent in encouraging them to disengage from the language of their tradition and really go into felt sense, to kind of develop this experiential language that is directly related to what they're experiencing. But we didn't do it in fMRI, we did it with the EEG. I'm yet to analyze the data in terms of the EEG, but in terms of the subjective experiences, I mean, it's the dynamics that they, so another element or aspect of the technique that we used called microphenomenology is not asking about what you're experiencing, but how you're experiencing. What's the process? You know, when a thought arises, what happens? What's the process? How the relationship to the thought, as opposed to what's the thought content? And it's, you know, it's the descriptions are, you know, there's a great intersubjective agreement within tradition and between traditions, and also the analogies that people use to describe this sort of dance between, you know, being pulled towards a particular content, and then that sort of curiosity that kills the cat, and then dropping back into this mindful non-dual awareness. Again, the analogies people use are very similar regardless of the tradition, provided you keep on returning them back to the felt sense. So yes, I don't unfortunately have a slide to show you, you know, from fMRI. This is, I only have single case studies actually of just this kind of resting in open presence from experienced practitioners in Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the Dzogchen practitioner, Zen practitioner, and very experienced practitioner of secular mindfulness, you know, clinical psychologist who's done a lot of secular mindfulness, doesn't necessarily go to Buddhist retreats or know the kind of Buddhist philosophical and psychological concept framework. And you see the same things. You see this deactivation of the default mode network, great activity of this area called thalamus, which is a sensory gate, being like really open to any senses, any external senses. The bilateral activity of the area called insula, which is an area associated with interoceptive awareness. So really embodied, really present to what's there. Not much else is persistently active. If there is no grasping, if there is no processing, if there is no emotional reaction, then you don't see the limbic areas, the frontal areas coming up so much. So the signature is similar, but those are single case studies, which unfortunately I can't publish. But you know, we kind of need more work. I mean, this is one of the difficulties in this field, is that this experienced practitioners, they're so unique. Lumping them into groups doesn't make sense. And actually a lot of the subtle effects get diluted when you start analyzing them, you know, as a group. And because I don't have access to experienced practitioners in the way that Richie Davidson's lab has, you know, it's quite a process to sort of find them, get them into the lab, and then also have a sensitivity to other traditions and understanding their language. You know, I'm more or less confident and fluid in my understanding of Dzogchen, but the terminology, even in Plum Village, as I discovered in my conversations with Liam, is quite different. So it takes a bit of time to understand, you know, which labels, which words designate the same felt sense, the same state or way of being. So yeah, but very interesting, but we're not there yet.
Okay, thank you, Elena. The next question is from Nina Espinosa.
Thank you very much. Dear Tai, dear Sangha. Has been a very interesting talk, and I would like to ask to Dr. Elena or Brother Pavlin or Dr. Liam, do you see or have studied the relationship between creative activities such as painting and drawing and meditation?
From the neuroscience point of view, it's very difficult to do it either with fMRI or EEG, because you have to be still with fMRI, and fMRI you also have to be lying down, you know, in a long tube. So to be able to engage in a creative activity whilst being scanned with fMRI is pretty impossible. It's probably easier with the EEG, but my kind of immediate intuitive sense that as we talked with Brother Fablin during our dialogue, there would be a difference in the brain activity, because when we're in meditation, it's sort of mindfulness at rest, so to speak. But the sense of flow is this mindfulness in activity, right? So when we engage in a creative activity, we will expect different brain dynamic, and actually that same default mode network might be more active than when we are at rest, because you know we might be engaging with the thoughts that come up, that become part of our creative process, might not be necessarily grasping to them, identifying with them as we would when we just kind of in our day-to-day life. But yes, so the dynamic would be somewhat different. But experientially speaking, as we were saying, it's just the difference between mindfulness in rest versus mindfulness in activity. And there is a little bit of kind of debate in the creativity literature whether mindfulness is incompatible with the state of absorption required for the flow type experiences. I think both Brad Fablin and I agree that that's not the case. The studies that seem to indicate that they define mindfulness as the state of observation, where you're kind of splitting almost like an observer and observed. But it's again a kind of element of mindfulness of the beginner. So when mindfulness is effortless, there shouldn't be that splitting, and therefore it should be very easy to go into the state of flow. It would be different from just being kind of aware of everything that is going on, this kind of open awareness. You would be directing it towards particular activities, so it would feel kind of more encapsulated, but it still would be a flow where there is no kind of getting stuck on any particular frame of experience that happens.
Okay, great.
But to answer your question more directly, it's very difficult to compare the two in practical sense using your imaging methods.
Thank you, Elena. So the last question is from Evie Beck.
Dear Elena, hello. I've enjoyed this session very much. Both my researcher heart and my practitioner heart. It feels like I've received a Dharma talk and science in one go, and I think that's a first in my life. So thank you very much. I was wondering, because you've been asked a lot of questions through this session, and I was wondering, from your point of view, as a practitioner and a researcher, maybe you've already answered this, but if you haven't, what would you say is the most important finding or important implications of your findings, both for us as practitioners and us as researchers. Would you like to share with us, please?
Evie, thank you very much for your warm words. It's a difficult one. What would be the most important one? Well, I think the findings around this sort of default mode network and what the brain dynamics look like when we're in this sort of state of self-grasping, I think has been probably one of the most important findings of the neuroscience of mindfulness, because it made so much sense in terms of mindfulness applicability for various common mental disorders, so this kind of transdiagnostic intervention. It really created sort of an evidence base to make it available to more and more people who wouldn't have come across the practice otherwise. You know, if they didn't come across Buddha Dharma, they got initiated into the practice through this means. And I feel, for me as a practitioner and scientist, the science part holds that key, that, you know, science is yet another way of communicating the benefits of the practice. But practice speaks for itself. So I would say we shouldn't look to science for validations and justifications. The practice speaks for itself, but the science helps us to create evidence base to allow more and more people to benefit from the practice.
So thank you so much, Elena, and thank you everybody for participating in this session. It's been, I think, very alive for all of us. I don't know if you can hear me, Elena.
Here.
We can. So yes, I think just on behalf of everyone in Plum Village, we really want to express our gratitude for you having been so generous with your time to share also your experiences as a practitioner and the insight that's come from the research and it's very for us. I think it's very exciting to see what is also still going on. Many unanswered questions. And yeah, I think it's just nice to discover a kind of to feel the spirit of scientific curiosity and engagement. You know, looking into the practice with a lot of openness as well, and all the qualities of a meditation practitioner. So thank you so much for your time and generosity, and we look forward to continuing this connection with Mind and Life Europe and yourself and other researchers. I think it's very enriching for all of us. So let us end the session maybe with the sound of the bell, and yeah, we offer you a deep bow of gratitude. And just a reminder that for anybody who would like to watch the whole of the recorded conversation, which was a lot longer, there were several other studies that Elena presented and a lot of other areas we went into, and that will be available soon. We'll let everybody know on the Teachable platform when that goes up. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, and we wish you a peaceful night.